Tracy mentioned, we're starting to drill down and kind of get to the final stages of the Yavapai passenger transportation study. And what we wanted to do today is show you the strategies that we're recommending specifically for this region, get some of your feedback on those strategies, do a little prioritization, and then so that we can take them forward to bring them into the plan and start to finalize them. So as you know, there's a lot of passenger transportation needs in Yavapai County, and some of the trends that are interesting is one, I think all of you are familiar with this, but rapid growth in the county, and then within that growth, there's a fair amount of the population that is transportation disadvantaged. So that includes people who are over the age of 65, under the age of 18, people with a disability, people with low income, people who spend a high portion of their income on rent, and then a very small portion of the population that has no vehicle at all, or a household that has no vehicle at all. So we estimate it's roughly between a quarter and a third of the population may be disadvantaged with it when it comes for transportation or experience some kind of transportation challenges. So we also looked some of the other things, you can go to the next slide, is in employment and specifically unemployment. So in 2018, Yavapai County had an unemployment rate of about 4.5%, which is roughly equal to the state. But if you go to the next slide, of course, one of the things, and this has been all over the national news, and I think everyone's thinking about this almost all the time, is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on employment. And so what this means specifically in Yavapai County is that unemployment has doubled in the past, not probably 12 months, but probably 9 months or 6 months since March. We sort of generally speaking, a lot of the assumption is that unemployment is really a function of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and the reductions in traveling and just sort of the public health concerns overall. And once we get over that, the economy will start to rebound quickly. And some of the things that we've learned from past recessions is that this ability to get workers back into their jobs is paramount to getting the economy restarted and starting to get back into that growth mode. So between June 19 and June 20th, we've seen the unemployment rate double from 4.7 to 9.2. And when we're thinking about transportation and transportation needs and some of the things that we want to do, we know that as the public health starts to become more positive and kids go back to school and people start to go back to work, that we're going to need to be able to get them to work. And so transportation and providing options is a key part of that. As part of this study, you can go to the next slide, we did take a look. A lot of these maps show the, yeah, there you go. Show travel patterns and travel needs and where people are going. So we do see quite a bit of travel within the Quad Cities. Also transportation demand to get to Phoenix in particular. So those are some of the things that have influenced where some of the strategies that are being proposed. So you can go ahead to the next one. And then I think many of you helped out and filled out a survey as part of this study. And what we learned from that survey is that when we ask people why passenger transportation services should be improved, they really want to help those people, those transportation disadvantaged folks, make sure that people can get to service and medical appointments and getting to work. So that's very consistent with the needs that we found with the data, is what people think transportation should do and what people's intuition and what their experience is suggesting where their transportation needs are. So that's positive. Well, it gives us confidence that those are the things, those are the problems that we need to start to solve. So Tracy and her team and Jen and Pedro and Todd have been working a lot on putting together strategies for Yavapai County overall. And then we also, there's one more slide here about some of the regional needs, and in particular connecting some of the regional service centers. So this means Wickenburg, Phoenix, and Prescott, and then making sure that there's service on the priority corridors, so that people can get to where they need to go, not only within Prescott, but also from Prescott to some of the other major employment and service centers regionally. So when we get down to the strategies, the 5 that surfaced as among the most impactful and the most important for the region and this is longer term, there's short-term needs, but also over the next 3 to 5 years. So implementing the TRIP plan, which I know many of you participated in all those discussions, and of course Nelson Nygaard was the consultant that led a lot of that, the most recent version of that effort. A second strategy is van pool. A third one is intercity bus network. A fourth one is scaling the ADOT planning requirements to better match the amount of planning that needs to be done. And then a fifth one is coordinating volunteer drivers. So I'm going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. The transportation, and I'll go through all 5 of these, and actually there's 6 slides, and then we can pause, have a discussion, and then as Tracy mentioned, we can go to Menti and do some voting on these. So the TRIP plan, and I know many of you participated in this, and you've heard me present about it quite a bit, and probably several other people have talked about it, but it's the transit implementation plan that was just finalized in February of this year, focused on creating some demand responsive, like microtransit zones in Prescott and Prescott Valley, and then connecting those demand response zones with flexible fixed route service. So Prescott to Prescott Valley, downtown Prescott out to the airport. There were a handful of fixed route services in there. And we developed this plan in conjunction with many of you, and it really is designed to connect people, connect workers to jobs, provide those services for people who are trying to get to the hospital, trying to get to the doctor, trying to get to the grocery store, and then also connect with YRT services so that the rural services can come into the urban services, and people will have a lot of mobility and really be able to get to where they want to go. Of course, we know that Prescott and Prescott Valley does have some federal funds that they haven't been able to access. I think there's about 1.2 million there. In order to get those resources, the region would have to come up with some local money, and that's really the stumbling block to moving forward with this. There is some potential of taking advantage of some CARES Act funding, but this TRIP plan is still where we're trying to go. It's going to take, for sure, we know it's going to take several years anyways to get there, but that's kind of one of the main strategies that's going to address a lot of the transportation needs in Prescott, Prescott Valley, and the Quad Cities, in fact, because YRT will help us with some of those connections. And then in the next slide, in the short term, there may be some steps that we can look at, and in particular doing some of these demand responsive microtransit services in Prescott and Prescott Valley. If we were going to move forward with some of those things, and some of these may be able to be funded by the CARES Act funds, we're trying to look into that right now. Any new service would be developed in collaboration with the existing services, so that means not only connecting to and making sure that we're coordinated with YRT, but also some of the existing service providers and some of the existing vehicles and drivers that are already available in the region. So we feel like these microtransit zones are really important because they do provide access to medical services. They allow people to get to the grocery store or to do their shopping. It can also, as some of the jobs start coming back, it can help people get to work. And then finally, it could also provide this first and last mile if the region were to invest in some intercity buses, so if there was service from Verde Valley into Prescott, for example, or from Wickenburg into Prescott, once somebody got dropped off at Courthouse Square, for example, they would be able to get to their final destination. And so this would be a strategy that would need to be led by the cities of Prescott and Prescott Valley as part of the urban areas, but there are a lot of important partners, including the nonprofit agencies, but also the institutions like the colleges and the hospitals, and I know that there's a lot of transit stakeholders in the Quad Cities, and so there's a lot of opportunities for people to collaborate and work together. The funding is potentially from the Federal Transit Administration, but also would require some partnerships and contributions, and of course passenger fares. And that funding is really the challenge for the short-term success. So the next slide talks about van pools, and we know again that the employment market's a little bit depressed in the short term, but we know that over time, and especially coming out of a recession, that people are going to need access to jobs. And there's some jobs in the region that wouldn't be served by these local transit services. So if somebody had a job in Sedona or in Phoenix, for example, or the Baghdad mines, those are some of the job markets that could be accessed by van pools. And van pools can be a really cost-effective strategy. They can be a little bit difficult to get started. And but there are strategies to do that, and we need to just find a handful of employees that have the same start time and the same finish time. And so, for example, when there's shift works, that's very possible to do. VAMPLs have been successful all around the country, including in Arizona in the Phoenix region. So VAMPLs are, I think they're going to be important for the region, and the important things are to find somebody who can take the lead on the organization, and then VAMPLs are really responsive to the needs. So if people need to go to work in Sedona, or if they need to go to Phoenix, then the VAMPLs can follow those employees, and you can use federal transit funds to do that. Employers often subsidize VAMPLs as well, and then of course riders can pay fares. And then the next slide talks about the intercity bus network. And that is, as part of this study, we've really seen some of the demand between some of these service centers. You know, of course, Yavapai County is enormous, and there are regional service centers. Prescott and Prescott Valley is one of them. The Verde Valley is another. Wickenburg is another. And so the idea is that we will have a network of where these communities are connected, and then also connected into Phoenix. And so if somebody can get to Prescott, then maybe they can also get to Verde Valley and they can get to Phoenix. Or if somebody can get to Verde Valley, they can get to Wickenburg. So this idea that we have some longer distant bus services that provide connections, especially from some of the rural areas, into the regional centers, and then connect those regional centers, you start to have a network that mimics what's available to people driving. This would be a project that would need to be led probably at the state level or at the regional level, so we're looking at ADOT or potentially NACOG to do that. And there is federal money that can do that, 5311F money, funds that can be used to that, but there is also some local funds that would be needed. And then this is also a service that would take a little bit of time to kind of, a little bit of a runway to ramp up and get started. We expect that potentially ridership could be a little bit low in the beginning, but as time, intercity bus networks have proven to be really successful. And then of course we do need that distribution network, either for riders who don't have a car, either to get to the bus or to get from the bus to where they're going. And then the next strategy is about scaling the ADOT planning process. One of the things that we heard about this study is that the Arizona DOT, there's some of the planning requirements are cost prohibitive, or they're a little bit onerous given the amount of work that needs to be done or the amount of service that needs to be done. So what we're advocating for here is to scale that planning process so that it kind of matches what the needs are. So if you're just planning for one route, you can do a really small study. If you're planning for a bigger system, you could do a bigger study, but we just need a little bit more tailoring for some of those requirements. And then the last strategy is about a volunteer driver network. And we know that there are some volunteer driver services already in the Quad Cities. And the idea would be to expand upon this, make more of a coordinated network so that both the drivers and the volunteers have a little bit more flexibility and it's a little bit easier to find who needs a ride and then connect those, and then find people who are willing to do the driving and connect them and make sure that people have as much access to transportation as possible. We know volunteer drivers are a really effective way to provide trips because the volunteers can be very caring. They can provide a high level of service. They do it for free or they do it to be reimbursed for their mileage. The cost of a driver is something like 80% of the cost of providing service. So if you can have a driver be a volunteer, then you save a lot of your services. So it's very, very cost effective. And it provides a high level service that's really important to the community. So there are some sort of considerations moving forward with this. Is one, figuring out who is going to be the one to lead the coordination and the expansion of the volunteer driver network, coordinating the service area to match where the volunteers drivers are. There's a lot of partners. There's some of you are already doing this already. And then the funding can come from grants and from some community mobility funding. So with that, I think I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about any of these strategies in more detail.
Thank you, Tracy.
I'm sure somebody has some questions about this.
And for the people who are on the phone, again, the five strategies are implementing a trip plan, van pool, intercity bus network, scaled ADOT planning process, coordinated volunteer driver network.
And this is Tracy. I'll say again, the purpose of the strategies that we've identified here is to address the need to either enhance existing service or to provide service where there is a gap. And certainly the trip plan is a starting point for a lot of that, but to access other components or areas of the county or to have other areas of the county access the CYMPO region, that's what a lot of several of the other strategies that are listed focus on.
This is Lindsay. I have a question about the trip plan implementation strategy.
Okay. Go for it.
My question is the micro-transit zones that we're talking about starting with, are those limited to the relatively narrow zones that were planned in the trip plan? My concern is that if we're going to start with the demand response piece of the plan, then it needs to cover the whole region, not just those relatively narrow sections, Prescott and Prescott Valley.
So the trip implementation plan, you're right, Lindsay, it's like a whole network. That's in the way that we envisioned it, is that it would kind of all happen at once, which of course it doesn't really happen like that. If we step into microtransit zones first, then we can define what those zones are based on available funding. But if we were going to use CARES Act funding for that, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that does mean that they would be limited to Prescott and Prescott Valley because it's the urbanized part of the service area. Is that what you meant? Like, so that it covers a bigger part of the urban area, or were you saying it should also go to Chino Valley and Dewey Humboldt?
Well, it should certainly connect between Prescott and Prescott Valley, and ideally connect to Dewey Humboldt. But my understanding of the original trip plan was that those were intended to be an internal circulator and not a means of getting from Prescott to Prescott Valley or from Prescott Valley back to Prescott, that they would be internal to each of the communities. And that doesn't solve very much of our problem if we do just demand response service internal to one community and in a fairly narrow part of that community.
Right. So in a short-term step for a microtransit zone could include service between Prescott and Prescott Valley. I don't think it could include service to Dewey Humboldt, but it could be Prescott to Prescott Valley and then connection service between the two. That is possible. That can be a recommendation.
Why is that the recommendation, to start there as opposed to starting with the flex route between Prescott and Prescott Valley?
So I think just based on the fact that really focused on older adults, people with disabilities, and then supporting people get back to work. I would say that there's not a whole lot of difference between microtransit and deviated flex service. Microtransit is just a little bit more like dial-a-ride, a little bit less structured than some of the deviated flex routes that we were proposing as part of the trip study. But this would still, so the idea would be that there would be three pieces: Prescott Valley, and then connecting the two. And so you could get picked up somewhere in Prescott and then take that service into Prescott Valley right to your destination. Whereas a deviated fixed route might say go from the courthouse square to the library in Prescott Valley, and then from there you would transfer. And then by doing a microtransit service, you could pick you up at your door and drop you off at your door. Does that make sense?
I agree with, yes, but I agree with you that the service is suitable for serving the needs of elderly and with disabilities who are primarily going to shopping services, medical appointments. But I don't think it does a very good job of serving folks who are on work commutes, and particularly, 5-day-a-week work commutes. And we've known with our most recent trip plan and even the one that we did 10 years ago, that the largest underserved population in terms of transportation is work commuters. And that's been an emphasis in this process as well. And I don't think that those demand response steps serve that population very well at all.
So, and what is it that you think that they don't do such a good job with? Because in my mind, they're very similar, especially.
I think they don't do a good job with serving frequent work commutes, like 5-day-a-week, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 work schedules. You're asking those workers to call in 24 hours in advance, set up that trip, and so you're going to have, if a lot of workers do call in and reserve those rides, you're going to have really high peak demands during the start of the workday and at the end of the workday. And I don't think that's sustainable with demand response.
So, Lindsay, this is Tracy. Within the context of the YPTS study, what we've talked about here today are 5 strategies, with the trip implementation, short and long-term strategies being one of the 5. One of the others is van pool, which is very much focused on employment and access to employment. Is that something that you see as supportive of the needs within the CYMPO region?
Potentially. I think the difficulty with the van pools being the answer or a primary answer to work commutes is the fact that we don't have a lot of clusters of employees. You've mentioned Baghdad, which is certainly the case. We can make a case for work commutes to the county jail complex over in Camp Verde. But there aren't a lot of other places where you have a substantial number of employees going to work at the same location at the same time that would facilitate van pool being established for that purpose.
Yeah, and just I think that's why we are promoting van pool, right? Because there aren't a lot of clusters. But it makes sense to just send a vehicle where we need one, and it does give access to people to these further out employment opportunities where the costs of getting there are higher. And then kind of getting back to this idea of the microtransit. So one of the things about stepping into the program is if we ended up having a lot of demand, we can put in the fixed route service. But until we start to build that demand, and especially because things are changing so rapidly right now, or they have changed so dramatically, that what we're thinking is that doing a microtransit zone, so it's not necessarily 24 hours in advance. It can be you can get a ride within 20 to 30 minutes, something like that. But you're saying, okay, I got to get to work by 8:30. I'm going to call the bus at 8. It might ask you to walk a block, depending on how it ultimately got implemented. But there would be, it could get you from one door to the other door. I think it could be a higher level of service, especially in the short term. And then if demand outstrips that, you could replace it with a bus. And I think the idea is to get started with something that's going to provide the most flexibility to the greatest number of people, see how people are using it. And then as the economy starts to rebuild again and we have some more stability and we see that demand that's kind of building in a way that's more predictable and understandable, then we can swap in a deviated flex route.
I'll also say that while the coordinated volunteer ride networks have focused a lot on, and this has come up a lot in the more rural areas of the county that we've talked to in terms of taking advantage of the existing networks in those areas and how they're using social media, Facebook and Nextdoor to coordinate rides, but not in a structured fashion. That also can be done for employment and to establish regular carpool and ride sharing for employment needs, and that there are platforms that can assist with that, whether it's something like a Ride Amigos or a Loom or a Scoop, and those are 3 platforms that are out in the market right now to take advantage of. And then Valley Metro actually has a webinar this week on a car share and carpooling program that they're implementing as well. So that is another strategy that is kind of a sub-strategy that's captured within this volunteer ride network strategy itself that would can address again, employment, connection to employment. And for any of these, certainly this idea of first, last mile, or getting a person and having people be able to connect with one another and take them within the area of their employment, that is the biggest challenge in terms of getting people to try a passenger transportation service that isn't a single occupancy vehicle if we're trying to shift people out of that mode, and also to get people to use this as a means of accessing employment when they have no transportation access overall.
This is Sandy. I have a question.
Go for it.
And that is, in your preparation for these recommendations, I believe one of the steps was to look at peer agencies. And I wondered if you have found a rural area of whatever size we're talking, 200 square miles or 100 square miles, that has implemented a microtransit system or a reasonably successful van pool system that we as the consumer could look at for how that works.
So we have, I don't know if you guys did some peer review specific to the Yavapai passenger transportation study, but that I might not know about. Tracy, do you have, but I know that these recommendations, if they get prioritized, we can provide some of that information, because there are, van pools have been successful in a whole variety of markets, including rural areas, and then, or not rural, but lower urban, but with lower densities. And then the microtransit, what we're seeing is a lot of the urbanized transit agencies at the kind of fringes of their service area, where it becomes more suburban and slightly lower density, which is kind of more aligned with the land use patterns in Prescott and Prescott Valley, that they are switching from fixed route to microtransit at this moment, because ridership on transit systems has dropped so dramatically in response to the public health issues. And then as it starts to build back, we can, we'll try the experiment and see what riders like. If they prefer the microtransit, we can keep that or switch back to fixed route.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? You sure? Those were good ones. I'm sure some other people have some additional ideas or comments.
I guess I had a comment. I believe with the microtransit companies, I think you can schedule rides, not just, I think it's at the minimum 48 hours in advance, but I think you can schedule them up to maybe 30 days or maybe a couple of weeks, something like that. If you have, some sort of schedule that you want to follow, you can probably reserve those rides in advance. I think this was kind of in regards to Lindsay Bell's question. Her
concern, yeah, that's a good point, Pedro. Yeah, so you could, if you knew that you needed to get to work every day at 8:15 and you wanted to make sure that there was that service was going to get you there at 8:15, you could book it for some time in advance. every day, for example, or Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or whatever your work schedule is, to provide that guarantee.
This is Todd Morris with NACOG. Could you guys go to the connecting communities slide?
Regional needs?
Intercity bus network. Yeah, I guess I'm just really curious if there's any comments from the group on this strategy, this slide, as it's kind of been something I think we've been paying a lot of attention to in terms of how to connect the county, both to communities within Yavapai County, as well as to kind of major activity centers in neighboring counties. And so I'm curious from the group, are there any kind of comments or gut reactions that come out when we talk about sort of long distance service out of Prescott and Prescott Valley to other communities? Okay. Well, I guess we know that there's some public or some private providers that are already, providing service. In looking back at some of our previous plans, we found that a lot of those services are cost prohibitive for people that need to get down to Phoenix for healthcare. And so I just know that causes a tremendous strain on our existing 5310 service providers to doing those long distance trips. And so that's just a strategy that we're curious about is developing more of a formalized service that could maybe help access some of those major specialty clinics in the Phoenix area, or even Flagstaff for some of the areas of Yavapai County.
Todd, this is Roger with Yavapai County Public Works. I would just make one comment is, how do you gauge, how many people would be interested in doing a long distance commute of that nature? I guess the question is do you have one trip per day, and then whoever gets on that trip would be that would be the only option for that day. I mean, how do you balance the long trips with the need, I would guess? And so if the need is there, how is that determined, and how could you identify where the need is highest? Is it between Prescott and Phoenix? The Yavapai County's so large, and being that it's so large, getting to some of these outlying areas within the county can be kind of problematic, and maybe not as time efficient as what would be needed to make the transit system be effective. So I guess my only comment would be is, if we're looking at the long distance travel opportunity for people to get from point A to point B, is that we're looking at areas that would be more, I guess, concentrated as far as those long distance travel opportunities versus spreading it out.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this question, or I don't know if somebody else wants to.
I was just going to say, thanks, Roger. We do have some data from our surveys where we do talk about connections from certain geographic regions to what we're calling major activity centers or kind of larger towns. So we have some kind of preliminary information on the potential demand for some of those connections. But I think a really important thing that we're trying to determine is what levels of service would be needed to provide these types of connections. So is it a service that runs every day, or is it a service that maybe just runs once or twice a week and allows people to sort of schedule around that existing service to get higher performance out of the system? And so I think that's kind of the crux of the challenge that we're facing, is trying to figure out what that magic middle ground is that will yield successful and performance measures.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I mean, there's some clues that we have. One is the overall travel flow. So where, and that's data that we have either from the census or that we've collected from surveys or other means where we know, for example, that within Yavapai County, it's between the Verde Valley and Prescott, for example, let's say, that the greatest number of people are moving between those two cities. And then we can say, all right, how many trips are there a day? What portion of them could we reasonably capture? And then it does take a while to get these kind of services started, because if they have never been able to take a bus between the two communities, it's going to take some time for people to schedule around it and understand that it works. But intercity bus has been very successful. Also, I think you have, in cases where you have communities that are constrained, either because the trip is long or gas prices are high or there's no place to park, or people need to go somewhere and it's they can't afford to take that trip, that you can start to build some ridership that's been really successful. And so there's a lot of data that we can use, and then we know that there's some typical times when we schedule intercity bus. Usually it's like trying to get people there by 8 or 8:30 and then home by 5 or 5:30, or then leave at 5 or 5:30. Sometimes we can do a midday trip, so that allows people to do a half day or a full day in that destination. So it can be difficult to time them so that both we might want to make sure that people could get into Prescott at 8 a.m. and also get into downtown Sedona at 8 a.m. And so that means you have to run two buses if you're going to meet both of those times. But once there are some techniques and there's some strategies that have worked in other places, and often there's communities that have a certain connection with each other that we can leverage and take advantage of to start to build that ridership and develop that market. Service to airports works, yeah. Go ahead, Tracy.
This is Tracy. I was going to say a couple of other things regarding this. One, it's not just about establishing the service or tapping into an existing service. There also is the importance of letting people know that the service exists and making an investment to make that platform of information available and accessible to people. And that's one of the great things about the website AZ Ride Info, that is up live and running, and right now is focused on providers are putting their information on there, and Chris Bridges and Todd can talk a bit more about that as well, because they've been involved in that. But that, again, is a platform to help people identify what is available to help them connect within a region and across regions. And to Bethany's point, there are examples of this longer distance super commuter service that does exist. I have a project right now in Stanislaus County in California. Our project is focused on pedestrian bicycle safety, but one of the services that we're connecting with is, or coordinating with to promote our program, is the super commuter bus program that's running people from Stanislaus County into the San Francisco Bay Area, which is about an hour-and-a-half commute. But the cheaper housing is in Stanislaus and the job opportunities are in the Bay Area. And that's a successful, more rural to urban commuter bus program.
I have to go. Good to see everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Sandy.
Bye.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.
Roger, was your question answered?
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to make that point, that we want to be efficient with what we're looking at.
Always, yeah.
If I can jump in on that for just a moment, as we're talking about the efficiencies of the long distance trips at New Horizons, we do a handful of those trips each month, and generally they are for low income people going to medical appointments. And these are also generally disabled people. What we found is they have a hard time not getting directly to where they're going, but with some comprehensive travel training, we can teach them to take whatever's available to the next stop, get onto another, like City of Phoenix transit system that'll get them usually very close to their medical appointment. but that comprehensive travel training needs to be comprehensive. It's going to be difficult to get people to change their habits from getting onto a small van and going directly to their doctor in Phoenix from Prescott, or getting onto a transit system that they may have to transfer to get to within a block of their doctor. But I think it's an exciting next step that, you know, over time, once we get folks trained, it will work. I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.